Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the concept of a post-materialist social order. With me is Dr. Neal Grossman, who is an emeritus associate professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the author of Conversations with Socrates and Plato, How a Post-Materialist Social Order Can Solve the Challenges of Modern Life and Ensure Our Survival. He is also author of The Spirit of Spinoza, Healing the Mind. Welcome, Neal.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for coming to Albuquerque. When we think of a post-materialist social order, I guess it's fair to say that here in the 21st century, we live in a culture that is largely materialist, so yes, we would have a long way to go.
Yes. It's materialist in two senses, I think. One is the academic sense, that the leading scholars and theorists tend to be materialist atheists. But also in the day-to-day sense, and what people value and what they desire are material things. Mm-hmm. Status, which I look at as a material thing, and money, of course. Mm-hmm. These are the things that run our present culture. When people come back from the near-death experience, their values change 180. And part of the difficulty they have readjusting to this culture is because the values of this culture, the materialist values of this culture, are diametrically opposite to what they experienced in the state of heightened reality in the near-death experience, where everything there is an expression of or based upon unconditional love.
Mm-hmm. So your concept of a post-materialist social order would be a culture, a society based on the realities that people who have had the
yes,
near-death experience come back and report.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
What would a social order look like
mm-hmm, that
near-death experiences might not mind so much coming back to?
Yeah.
You know, many of them are upset to find themselves back.
Yes. I have, in my own therapy practice, worked with people, typical business people who are engaged in, tiny little white lies and cheating, which is normal yes, part of business yes, culture.
Yes,
and they come back after a near-death experience and they know they can't live the way they used to live, but they don't know how to change their life either because all their old habits are still there.
And the environment in which they find themselves reinforces mm-hmm, only their own habits.
Yeah. So you are a contemporary philosopher who takes the near-death experience seriously.
Yes.
You're looking at the philosophical implications of the near-death experience, and you've written this marvelous 800-page book which shows you in dialogue with four of the greatest thinkers of humanity, Plato and Socrates, but also Spinoza and my hero, William James.
Yes.
And discussing, what society could be like based on these findings, which are, of course, didn't exist when these great thinkers were alive.
Basically correct.
I know Plato wrote about...
Right. I mean, the first near-death experience recorded is in Plato. And William James, in his Varieties, writes a lot about the mystical
religious experience.
A lot about the mystical experience, yes, which he takes to be real.
And which is very much akin to the near-death experience.
Yeah, it's practically, they come back with the same values, mm-hmm, basically.
Yeah.
And something else they come back with, which is, and this is hard to get across sometimes, the self that they experience themselves as being when they're not in their body in the near-death experience context is a wider, more expanded version of the self that of the waking self that we experience. they will even say that the difference is as great as is the difference between the waking self and the dream self.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about ontological levels, and the experience in the near-death experience, state of consciousness, is experienced as vastly more real than this.
Mm-hmm. In other words, dying is like waking up from a dream.
That's what people say. That's how they report it. But they're waking up into a reality that's not only experience as greater than this one, but is based on unconditional love. Mm-hmm. Those are the values that they learn. And what they experience, at least the deeper ones, is the interconnectedness of all beings. So this sense we have in the waking consciousness that we are separate selves, with the self encapsulated somewhere, probably 2 inches here behind the eyeball, that is seen as an illusion, as not real. Mm-hmm. So, I don't see any reason why we cannot have a social order based on what is fundamentally real, which is the interconnectedness of all beings, and the unconditional love that, if I experience you as myself, right, that is what love is.
Well, now, the world's great religions were all, I think, founded by mystics, and they pretty much
all teach that.
But this is a little different because now we've got tens of thousands of people, I should think by now, have had recorded near-death experiences. So we have a database.
Yes, and this is what, you don't have to, go into some monastery for 25 years, and meditate or remove yourself from the world to have this kind of experience. And ordinary people are having these extraordinary experiences. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have a database, and we have it's multicultural, and so we can look at it. It's very interesting. There are some cultural influences, but there's a sameness that pervades all the experiences.
So, in a sense, your book, Conversations with Socrates and Plato, it's sort of like an updated version of Plato's Republic, talking about the ideal society.
It might be. I don't want to think of myself necessarily as reworking what is my favorite all-time book ever written, I think. But there's one difference that Plato was thinking of in terms of the Greek city-states.
Yes.
And asked the question, how can a city-state that's run by spiritually enlightened beings hold its own against neighboring states that aren't so governed? Mm-hmm. Right? But this book describes a world order, not just one part of the world. So it's the whole world has to be in on this, or it's not going to happen.
So you're just imagining, what would life be like if we had a heaven on earth?
Basically, yes.
Mm-hmm. And the first rule, as I recall, is that everybody would always speak the truth. There would be no deceptions. In fact, there could be no deceptions. The idea of deceiving another person would be an impossibility.
It's interesting to put it that way, and I think that's right. I think there are many ways you can put it. In talking to near-death experiencers, and I find this happening to myself as I get older, when I can't watch episodes on television where there's deception going on, where somebody is trying to lie,
which is sort of the basis of every situation comedy,
and that's what NDEers, near-death experiencers, it grates against them to see deception and lying in any form. There's no template for lying outside of the body, right? You can't fool the divine being, right? And nobody tries to.
Because your thoughts are known directly. Yeah, it's like everyone is telepathically aware.
I think, as you know, I don't believe there can be a literal description of what it's like there.
Because it's beyond words.
Because it's beyond words. Exactly. That's the first thing that every near-death experiencer and mystic says, that you can't really talk about it, or you can't really say it in words.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, that doesn't stop them from talking, and so the words become pointers, not literal
Descriptions.
Descriptors.
Yeah.
But the sense was that their inner life, their thoughts and emotions, are as visible to other spirits as clothes are to us when we see a person. So there's no point in hiding or trying to conceal.
It's like what people sometimes describe as seeing the aura.
Yeah, basically. Basically. So
no one can hide.
Right. So I think one of the early chapters is on lying, how children are taught to lie by misreporting their feelings, their inner life.
As soon as they learn to speak.
To speak. They learn to use language.
Language is the vehicle by which people deceive.
That's right. It can be a vehicle by which people express what is their truth inside them. But in our culture rewards the liar, the con artist. There's a deep history of that.
In some sense, they're almost glorified.
Yeah. I think the guy who gets away with something,
well, that goes back, of course, to Homer and Odysseus.
Yes.
The Trojan horse.
That's right.
Was considered, a great heroic moment in Greek tradition.
Yeah.
And in fact, throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, Odysseus is constantly pulling tricks on people. I think that even the word Odyssey or Odysseus, the man of many turnings. So we have very early in Western culture this image of a person who becomes successful through deception.
Yeah, and that was probably a part of our evolutionary process, right? To develop our wits, develop the mind, the cleverness part.
And you find it in the Bible as well, now that I think about it. Abraham, the founder of the Abrahamic traditions, goes to Egypt with his wife Sarah, and the Egyptian pharaoh takes a liking to her, even though I think she's probably 100 years old or so at this point. So Abraham pretends that she's not his wife so that he doesn't displease the pharaoh. And I believe the pharaoh takes Sarah to bed or something along those lines. Or maybe there's a dispute because Abraham has lied to Pharaoh. So it goes back in both the Greek tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition, where some of the religious heroes are dishonest.
Yes.
Or cultural heroes.
Yes. And I guess a question that a philosopher should ask is, well, is this by nature or by nurture? Right? Are humans somehow hardwired to lie and to deceive, or to use language in that way? And I believe the answer is no. I see no reason why we cannot have a social order that's in harmony with what we know about the divine. And if it ends up not being possible, it's certainly a worthy goal to strive for. If you look at the economic and political spheres, right, that's where lying and deceit is most dominant, most dominant. Is that necessary? Can we have the economics of a country and the politics run by honest people, by people who don't lie?
I'm pretty sure that ethical specialists would all agree with you. They would all say lying is unethical. Not only unethical, but it often turns out to be bad for business, bad for governments. People usually are not able to keep those secrets.
Yes.
They get exposed anyway, and somebody is then exposed as a liar. And yet we also have another standard, which is that governments in particular need to lie. That governments need to keep secrets. That all sorts of plots or schemes of different kinds need to be protected, or negotiations.
Right. But I think we can see, or should be able to see, the handwriting on the wall, that way of running the world with governments lying and to try to upend one another is leading to our extinction, is leading to the destruction of it. And the question is, will people see that in time? There are many cases of, I don't know, tobacco addicts. They know that what they're smoking is killing them, but they continue to smoke. So are we that addicted to greed and personal ambition?
Yeah. You particularly take on corporations in your book. You point out that if a corporation is legally structured so that their prime directive is to produce a profit for their shareholders, then if they need to lie or deceive in order to achieve that end, as long as they're not breaking another law, and usually it's not illegal to lie, and sometimes it is, but they'll do it anyway, that we have a culture in which corporate executives in particular are given this incentive to lie.
To lie. Yeah, absolutely.
So that needs to be de-incentivized.
Right. And I suppose one can imagine the scenario, what if all corporate executives had a near-death experience? How would things change then? They
half of them would quit, I suppose.
Now, to back up a bit, I want to get to Plato on this, but all religions have something like Maslowian scales of moral development, where at the bottom is the greedy person, the selfish person, the person who's ambitious for his own wealth and doesn't care about his brothers and sisters. At the high end of moral development is the saintly person who experiences brothers and sisters as himself and connects with them and feels for them and seeks to serve them. That's the highest level of moral development. All religions recognize this. So why has the world allowed itself in the economic sphere to be ruled by the worst among us in terms of moral development, levels of moral development, by the greediest?
Yeah. Well, it's not always the case.
Not always. Nothing is always true. Well, maybe
that's an interesting logical paradox. Nothing is always true.
Right. There are always exceptions, of course, and there have been corporate executives with hearts of gold, right? But overall, Plato's solution that people, I think, misunderstand, and I think sometimes they deliberately misunderstand it, is that spiritual wisdom and moral development in character must go hand in hand with economic power. So those who hold economic power must be the same persons who are spiritually wise. That's his idea of the philosopher king.
But now the philosopher king also sort of lives in poverty, like a monk practically. It's more political than economic power, wouldn't you say?
I'm guessing back in those days, political power was economic power, that the two were not distinguished. But the idea is that why can't our economy be run by people who are the wisest? Why can't we have people like Mother Teresa running our economy and government? There are people like that all over the world.
Yeah.
Right? People, it would never occur to them that they could gain advantage through harming another person.
Well, it does seem to me that here in the West, we've all been influenced by Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, that if everybody just pursues their own selfish interests, that somehow magically that turns out to be for the benefit of the whole culture.
Yeah, well, we can see now where that has led. What self-serving nonsense, huh?
I'm not sure, to be honest. It seems to me that there's a role for government, that unconstrained self-interest would be bad, but if it was moderated, it's often, capitalism has led to many good things for people.
I'm okay with that argument, that developmentally at one point slavery was necessary, then feudalism, economically necessary. Then capitalism replaced that. And now something's got to replace capitalism because it's going to destroy the planet.
Well,
Because
that's a strong statement.
It's run by greed and by raping the environment.
Okay. So you're envisioning a post-materialist society will not be capitalistic.
No.
But it will still be providing people with goods and services.
Yeah, the wealth will be equitably shared.
Yeah.
And I think psychologists would agree that people do their best, who work their best, when there's shared interest. And when there's working for a common purpose.
Are you saying, for example, that heaven is socialist?
I think in heaven, the experience of oneself as not just connected with everything else, but as that with a one mind hypothesis.
The idea that I think John Donne, the great English poet, wrote, don't mourn when you hear the bell tolling. For whom is the bell tolling? It tolls for thee.
If you follow, I kind of like Larry Dossey's work and his One Mind, his book, The One Mind, that he presents it in very sort of easy ways to get the point. But
I'm under the impression you're taking this spiritual concept of one mind and translating it into a social structure, which maybe it's not socialism, but it seems a lot like socialism.
I don't care what you call it.
Yeah.
Just the basic thing is that the economic sphere must be run and controlled by those who are wisest and kindest.
But you're also suggesting a universal recognition that we are all one.
A recognition of the truths that are revealed in the near-death experience and a cultural acceptance that, this is the real thing, that the NDE is real. What would our culture look like? How would it change if the culture as a whole recognized that the near-death experience is real? And I think it would change in the direction.
I know that classical mystics talk about this experience of oneness with everything.
Yes.
Sometimes it's called cosmic consciousness. Near-death experiencers often talk about encountering a being of light. But do they also say they become one with that being?
Yes. Yes and no. It's the same as the mystical literature. In the West, most mystics, the Christian mystics, will say, I was one with God. But then you have some who will say, I became God. I was God. I experienced myself as God experiencing itself as me. Something like that. Yeah. With the near-death experience literature, you have a similar thing. Most will say they were in God's presence. They felt themselves in the presence of the divine, the breath of God. But some will say, I became God. I experienced myself as the divine being. Right? So that those are the deeper aspects.
Is it possible that some of them would say, yes, I experienced myself as one with God, but then I came back and I realized that all these other people are not one with God, just me.
They don't say that. They are one with God, but don't know it. Don't realize it.
So being one with God is equivalent to being at one or one with all of humanity.
Oh, yes.
And maybe even really, to push the point, all of nature.
Yes. Yes. You know, when we have a dream, everything in that dream is us. Right? Including our subjective experiences, but also the things we experience of other people in the dream, even objects in the dream. It's all consciousness.
Yeah.
And that's what the NDEers see in their experience. It's all consciousness. And it's the same consciousness manifesting in different ways.
I mean, this reality that we think of as so substantial is, as Shakespeare suggested, like a dream.
And the evidence suggests, this is why I love William James, because he was not afraid to take the methods of science and apply it to spirit. And that's why I think all our scientist friends who work in this area, are in love with William James because they really appreciate what he was doing and how innovative it was and how completely different. I want to say certainly before, but even after, because as soon as James died, Harvard appointed some behaviorist and psychology basically was dead for 100 years.
Made a 90-degree turn after William James. Yeah, it's sad but true.
So, yeah. From looking at the inner experience of human beings to the outer behavior of rats.
Yeah. Well, you've taken this vision of the heavenly state as reported by the NDEers, and you've looked at what are its ramifications for life itself, a society, and then you go from birth all the way to old age and death. What would the human lifespan be like in such a culture?
Yeah, basically.
So child raising, for example.
It would be very different from now. It would be about caring for the child and bringing forth what is within the child. Everyone who comes here, it's not haphazard. It's not random. I believe that this might be Spinoza's influence on me, that there's order and reason behind everything. So we can talk about child rearing, but we can also talk about newly embodied souls.
Okay.
Because that's what they are.
Let's start right there. Yeah.
Newly embodied souls.
A newly embodied soul.
Comes with a purpose. It wants to express something here. Don't need to know what, but it wants to. And the job of the environment, the caretakers of the children, is to facilitate the child's expressing what it came here to express.
In other words, the idea is that we all are incarnated with a purpose.
Right.
Unique to each of us.
Yeah. And I state that the purposes are threefold. I was trying to think of what could the purposes be, but I could only find three. One is you come in with the intention of helping others. You come in with the intention of developing a talent and ability that you have. Maybe a gymnast, an athlete, a musician. You want to develop that talent. Right? Or you come in here, you're a seeker. You're looking for the truth. So you become a scientist or a philosopher. But I couldn't think that any soul would take on a body in order to make money, in order to be greedy, in order to have power over other human beings. Because from the divine perspective, well, it's like falling asleep and dreaming, and in the dream, you want to make money in the dream, but none of it is real. None of it is real.
Can't take it with you.
Definitely. And so I look at, my book looks at the soul that comes in and ends up as a moneymaker, as having lost their way. Because the only things that are of value to the soul, let's say, just the thought experiment. Your soul, and prior to incarnating.
Yes.
Okay, here's what I want to do.
Yeah.
Okay, you pick a body, you pick your parents, with agreement. That soul would never consider, I want to come in here and harm as many people as I can. I want to rise to the top of some hierarchy, none of which is real. And the soul knows that, right? It knows it's going to dim its lights in order to have a human experience, right? But the purpose of that experience has to be something relevant to the soul. And making money, or having a lot of earthly power is not something that helps the soul in any way. As the biblical saying goes, I think I quote that somewhere, so what does it profit a man? Right? And now I forget the rest of the quote.
To gain the world.
To gain the world, but
lose their soul.
Of course, you can't lose the soul.
Yeah.
But while alive, you can sort of not honor it by living in a way that's contrary to.
And I think in that phrase, the idea is that if you diminish your own character, your own integrity, you are losing something of your soul.
Yes. That's very strong in Plato's philosophy, that the person who harms another harms himself more. While here we can harm each other's bodies, right? We can do harm to another body. But doing harm to another's body harms the soul of the one, and that harm carries over.
Yeah.
Whereas the harm done to the other person's body does not carry over into anything. It doesn't damage the soul of that person. But so the soul damages itself by harming others while it's here.
Well, here on this earthly plane, we are the inheritors of centuries of warfare and oppression and abuse of different kinds. You're proposing a post-materialist society where, as the Buddhists sometimes say, all that ancient twisted karma is no longer relevant.
Right. Or no longer useful in any way.
No, it no longer has a grip on us.
Right. Yeah. So I was, into the writing of the book for 5 or 6 years. And during that process, the premise of it became more and more real to me as I was writing it. I thought it was problematic or a lot of wishful thinking, and maybe that's so. But now I really see no reason why we cannot make it on earth as it is in heaven.
And I think you would agree that William James, Spinoza, Plato, and Socrates were also pointing in that direction.
They were definitely pointing in that direction. Although probably Spinoza was more traditional, the traditional mystic in the sense you got to get out of society in order to experience this kind of clarity. He didn't say it that way, but he thought it would be rare. Whereas Plato is more concerned with the social order.
Yes. I mean, Spinoza's philosophy, as I understand it, which is certainly not much, is the idea that you have to accept whatever is.
Yes, absolutely. Because it is.
By accepting whatever is, you're aligning yourself with the divine will.
Yeah, because what is an expression of the one mind, or the divine will.
As much as you might disagree with it.
Disagree. But the acceptance of what is does not imply that what is now must be the same as what is tomorrow. It's not a fixed.
Because accepting what is also means accepting your own desire to change.
Yes, I think so.
So you have Spinoza dialoguing with you about these ideas, William James, Plato, and Socrates, but they all seem, as I read your book, they all seem supportive. None of them are telling you, Neal, you can't go in that direction.
Right. And it's certainly, this direction is, in Plato's it's implied in their philosophy. Yeah. Although William James certainly never asked the question, can we have a social order based on the values that people have when they come back from their mystical experiences? I think back then, well, even now, people think that those mystical experiences, even those who believe that they're real, will occur in the monasteries or haphazardly. But now so many people are having it, and the near-death experience. And I also have to mention another, we didn't talk about this, but I think it is a game changer in society, is the use of, I think now they're called entheogens. Entheogens.
Or psychedelics.
Enablers of the divine.
Yes.
And people are having these experiences and coming back changed permanently.
By the millions.
Just one or two. And now this is available to to everyone.
But I'm under the impression, though, that while people often have profound experiences under the influence of psychedelic entheogens, those experiences are not necessarily transformative in the same way that a near-death experience would be. Or if you look at the lives of the great mystics, you see that their lives were profoundly changed and they had enormous social impact. But, people who took LSD often don't. They go back to their previous lifestyle.
I want to say yes and no. I'm in general agreement.
Well, you were a student of Houston Smith who studied this directly. You were one of his students at MIT when he was experimenting.
I know. And in fact, my first experience of this was with Houston. I remember in his study, we took some psilocybin. I was just shy of my 20th birthday. And what a fantastic setting to take this thing that I believed was going to give me a spirit with a man I truly admired and who was my teacher and guru and guide.
Yeah, one of the great philosophers of religion of the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, he opened my mind to this. But in my experience, I experienced the interconnectedness of all things. But there was something in me that told me, this is not the mystical experience. This is not what I was reading about in the Hindu and Buddhist texts, which I was also learning from him. So I'm agreeing with you that the psychedelics, they can change people's lives if done in a clinical setting with guides. They can also destroy people's life if done, thinking at a party or something.
Now, I look back on my own life, and I can say quite honestly, the work I'm doing right now, interviewing you, creating the New Thinking Aloud channel, acquiring a doctoral diploma in parapsychology, all of that was consistent with and followed from some of the psychedelic experiences that I had, as well as other non-psychedelic mystical experiences that were occurring.
And I've just had this thought is you need to interview yourself. Because that's the base. So it was that direct experience. That's a direct knowing. It was a knowing that we are all interconnected, not just reading about it in
Well, let me just say parenthetically, for benefit of viewers who may not know, I have posted over 160 monologues on this New Thinking Aloud channel.
Okay. So I've got
I have in effect interviewed myself.
I've got some homework to do. Some years ago, I saw an interview with a guy. He was maybe my age. He had been a hippie. He dropped a lot of acid, and then he had later a deep near-death experience. He was asked to compare the two. He said, "There's no comparison." Okay, so the near-death experience is much, much deeper than the psychedelic experience, which is deep and does take you someplace. So another way to look at it is, well, once you're out of the body, right, it's not a uniform one-size-fits-all thing. There's as much differences and differentiation there and experiences to be had outside the body as there is inside the body.
Well, what we could call the super-sensible world, it's not all heavenly. Some people have near-death experiences. I understand, a small number, but they experience a hellish realm.
Yes. Well, just like people that can have nightmares. Right. Good people can have nightmares.
Sure.
So,
and sometimes a nightmare, it turns out to be a very beneficial thing.
Yes. I think the spiritual teachings, maybe Buddhist is more clear on this, is that your experiences in the next realm, the quality of them depends on how you live your life. And the measure here is always the golden rule. That's the bottom line. Are you treating people the way you would treat yourself? treating others? Or are you gaming the system? Or are you taking advantage of people? Do you see people as a means to your own ends? Or we're all in this together? And it's the latter orientation that leads to a peaceful experience in the, what do they call it, the Bardo planes, the other planes. But if you lived a life of greed and chasing after illusions, right, then, as they say, when you die, you're still the same. You're the same you experience yourself as this very same consciousness in the moment after death as you were prior to death.
There is neither heaven nor hell, but that the mind makes it so.
Yes. And what a beautiful statement of everything is consciousness. Right? But that applies to this life, whether we experience it as heaven or as hell.
So what you're proposing here, by virtue of creating in great detail the idea of a post-materialist society, is that we at least have the possibility of imagining a world in which the values of heaven are brought down. I guess that's in the Lord's Prayer too, to have a heaven on earth.
I had a friend, he's out of the country now, but who was a priest, very, very liberal. I mean, I asked him about the Lord's Prayer, because my interpretation on earth as it is in heaven was not a declarative statement that it is on earth as it is in heaven, but as an aspiration that may it become on earth as it is in heaven.
So you're taking that idea seriously.
Literally. Imagine that, taking the Lord's Prayer literally. How can we make it happen that it is on earth as it is? Well, how is it on heaven? Well, you go to the people, the end of years. What do they say? And this is the William James, the empirical approach to it. What do they state? What are the common elements? You abstract from the individual differences, and you get the unconditional love, the interconnectedness of all beings, the inability to hide, right? The inability to lie, basically. Well, why can't we do it here on Earth? Why can't, say, the natural resources of the planet be equally distributed, right? And I'm told that the Earth right now can produce enough food to feed everybody. So the problem why isn't that happening? It's because of the greed and personal ambition of a few people who control the distribution of goods. A relatively few.
But if greed, what if this idea of greed and personal ambition is sort of hardwired into us biologically? After all, if we don't eat, we die.
Yeah. You know, in some ways, I think there's a spiritual source for greed. Now, I'm talking very playfully here. So spiritually, in the NDE experience, say, and what mystics write, we are at home in the divine being. We are eternal. There are no threats to our continued existence. That's a given. But when we find ourselves embodied, there are now threats to our continued existence as a body, in the form of a body. Not in the form that we really are, the soul, but in this form of the body. So we want to protect this form. And so money, of course, is the main protector, because with that you can buy everything you need to protect this form. So the greedy person is one who is really very fearful and wants the security of his form enduring. In this world. So he thinks, well, if I have power over everybody else, then I'll be secure in this form. If I have enough money, then I'll be secure in this form. But the social order itself guarantees security in the form. Then there's no need to run about and look for money. Also, security in the form is not, it's a necessary thing, but it's not a worthy goal, because eventually the form is going to die. And we have
we will all
we
die.
have to be accepting.
But surely it's part of biological life everywhere. Every organism has a survival instinct.
That's true. But even among human beings, if you look at the scales of moral development, right, we're not all the same.
Right.
There are some who the money grubbers, they'll do anything, to make a buck, to gain what they perceive as advantage over fellow human beings. At the higher end, the people who will not do that.
So you're suggesting that spectrum is going to change?
That spectrum is moving upwards.
I see.
And so the bottom is
the bottom is rising as the top rises. Through
upbringing. If the heroes of a given culture are not the gamblers and the con artists, right? Because as the little kids get their role models from the heroes, little kids also learn to lie very, very early.
Well, you point out that as soon as you have language, you have the capability of lying. So are you suggesting that in the post-materialist society, if people are no longer capable of lying, that they have no language?
No, we still will need language. Although that's an interesting question. I don't really consider it in the book, but we can probably safely assume there'll be less need to use language, as there'll be more, I can just look at you and see what you're feeling, right? Or people will be more psychic, to be more open to these things.
Because language implies the capability of lying, even if...
Yes. Yes. And maybe that's part of the point of our growth and evolution. It's one thing to not lie when you can't, because your inner thoughts and emotions are visible to everyone in heaven. And it's another thing to not lie because you choose not to. Right? And I think that's maybe that's a very deeper sense of evolution. But lying, you've got to really identify with this form, with the physical form, think, I am this body and its personality. To the extent that you see yourself as more than just the personality and its body, to that extent, you'll be less concerned about lying. Right? Because...
children learn to lie at an early age if they do something for which they know they'll be punished. People lie to avoid punishment.
That's one reason, your hand gets caught in the proverbial cookie jar. But there's another thing that's just as insidious. So let's say Johnny and Susie, siblings, get into an argument, and mom steps in or dad steps in and say, "I'll stop that." And Susie, you apologize to Johnny for taking his candy. Susie doesn't want to apologize, but to please her mother. Or she's forced to say, I'm sorry, but she doesn't mean it. And that's among the earliest, you think it's a good thing to teach your children to apologize, for doing something, hurtful to another child. But it's not unless the child actually feels it. So how do you get Susie to feel it? Well, that's education. That requires a context with other children. So I have children in group therapy from age 2 and 3, where they talk about what happened during the day, where they felt good, where they felt bad. How did it feel to you when Johnny took this? How did it feel to you when Susie zipped up your jacket and when you couldn't figure out how to do it? Right.
So in the post-materialist culture, self-knowledge becomes something that's actually taught.
Yes, that. Somewhere I write that there's no problem for which adults will see a therapist that cannot be prevented through early childhood education, and that the three most important things about early childhood education are emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence. The ability to know what it is that you're feeling, and the ability to express that in words. With that ability, see, that's an ability that atrophies as people grow, especially for boys and men, where they conceal those feelings of vulnerability, those feelings that they think other boys might not approve of, and then they grow up and they become sort of empty shells, just of it. Women fare a little better in our culture, but maybe not that much. So, with emotional intelligence, to be able to know what it is that that you're feeling and to identify it and to locate the feeling in the body, comes the ability, I think, to know how other people are feeling. Now, we can sort of sense in a general way what other people are feeling through body language and facial expressions. But what would we like to go more deeply and to really see a person's feelings as clearly as we can see the expression?
Well, my philosophy about that is that you can't know another person more than you know yourself.
That's right. That's right. Which shows how we are all interconnected with one another.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I wonder if the reverse is true, but perhaps not. That you can know yourself without knowing other. But I think you could go together.
I would imagine that they go together.
Yeah, I think so.
So we're talking now about a society, I have to assume, where child abuse, for example, doesn't exist.
No, doesn't exist. No.
We currently live in a culture where I'm going to guess a healthy percentage of young children suffer from emotional or physical abuse. I imagine probably 25, 30%.
I think it's more than that. There's overt abuse.
Yeah.
And then there's a kind of abuse where the child's needs are not being met. The parents are very busy.
Yeah.
And they make sure, have you brushed your teeth? Did you do your homework? Did you do all these task-oriented stuff?
Yeah.
But not, what does it feel like? You just turned 6 years old. How are you feeling inside? Right? Where are you happy? Where are you unhappy? To give the child room to express themselves fully and to encourage the outer articulation of their real inner life.
At a whole society-wide level.
Yes, at a whole social wide level.
What a wonderful dream. Yeah.
Education begins in that way. And of course, it assumes that that the social order is in place, and so that the teacher of those child.
I know you're not talking about how we go from here to there.
Right,
you're
that's
talking
a different question.
about what there would be like.
Right.
Let's say in a society 1,000,000 years more advanced than ours.
We don't have that much time. Maybe 20 years.
Well, that's a separate issue.
Yeah, because the issue is being forced. And I think the human race is being asked, do you want to continue with this sort of the human experiment, or should we bring it to an end right now? The suffering of humans is just enormous. And it's all caused by my favorite villains, the greed and ambitions.
In other words, it's self-inflicted.
It's self-inflicted, yeah.
But you seem to be suggesting that if we aren't able to make this transition in the relative near
short
term,
time, yeah,
not 1,000,000 years from now, but in the next generation or two, the human race may not survive.
Correct. I feel that.
And paradoxically, it seems to me if people make a change because we think that's the only way we can survive, that's not the right motive. That the change can't be made based on fear.
I'm thinking about that. There's that movie Scared Straight, or something like that. Oh my God! Look what we're doing. We got to stop now and vote only for candidates that talk about loving one another, right?
Yeah.
On a global level. Vote only for people who talk about making the earth green. So I think one can be shocked into waking up from this, but then we do have the near-death experiencers who are coming from love and from understanding and from really wanting to bring heaven.
Now, I've interviewed quite a number of near-death experiencers, and I get the impression it often takes them decades to integrate that experience and change their life. It's not as if any of them are able to, turn around the next day and become a spiritual teacher of some sort. It's a very long and difficult process.
think that's true. I think in some ways, Eben has had it easier than most in terms of being out there as a spiritual teacher so relatively soon after his
soon, but still
experience.
Years.
I've known 2 or 3 NDE years personally. One is 7 years out. And she's now saying, I can see why people told me it takes 7 years. I'm still not done. Yeah. And another one, it was a colleague, actually. He was a professor in the history department. And this was a very powerful experience for me. We were on some committee. We had to do some report on some program or whatever, whether it was meeting in schools or whatever. So I went to his office, and I was coming right from my class carrying Moody's book.
Raymond Moody's book,
Life After Life, which I was trying to conceal in a way because, it's not really proper academic stuff. And so I was going to somebody in another department to his office. And of course, that's the first thing he sees. Oh, you got Raymond Moody's book. And I sort of said a little sheepishly, yeah, I'm using my death die class. And he says, well, I've had a near-death experience. We forgot about the report that we were supposed to do, and it was 3 hours of just intense, very, very intense conversation. And I thought I had believed it was real. But when I talked to Steve, he looked me right in the eye and said, I was there. It's real. The level of my belief went even higher than I thought was possible.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Well, I do know this, that the videos on this channel by near-death experiencers are widely watched. They're amongst the most popular. People really resonate when they hear those stories.
And what does that tell you? That deep within everybody's soul is the knowledge that the near-death experience is right.
It's like it awakens in many people a resonance.
That's right. As Plato once said, you can only teach people what they already know. Remind them of what they already know. And that's what the NDE is. People watch this.
And that's in effect what your book is doing.
Yeah, perhaps.
Your 800-page dialogue with Socrates, Plato, Spinoza, and William James in many ways it feels that way. It feels like, yes, let me remind you. If you look within, you'll see you already know this.
And I think in the process of writing it, I was reminding myself, perhaps most of all.
We should mention, Neal, that yes, you wrote it as a creative project, and as a teacher of philosophy, you've taught the Spinoza and William James and Plato and Socrates, but there was a sense, you even got some confirmation, surprisingly, unexpectedly, from a trance medium that maybe you were in touch with something more, something larger than just your own imagination, your own educated imagination.
I had no outline. I had no plan for it. I just showed up at my computer and wrote the thoughts that came to me. I did not, so unlike my namesake, Neal Donald Walsh, his conversations with God.
You didn't hear voices.
I wasn't hearing a voice separate from my own. They come as thoughts in my own mind. So subjectively, I don't have any grounds for saying it was really them. And I certainly taught those guys for so many years, 40 years, that I feel that they were my 4 favorite philosophers. So I feel I've somehow internalized, well, this is how they would think, or this is what William might say about this, or.
But you write about them as if they're friends.
Yeah, that's how it feels.
Yeah.
That's how it feels. Now, because of my own research interest in mediumship, and knowing both Gary and Julie personally, and
Gary Schwartz
and Julie Beischel, and knowing some mediums personally, there's no doubt in my mind that it's real. So I have to be open to it. Well, in my own case, could it be? I don't want to. So on the one hand, there's perhaps a false modesty that says,
well, we
those
don't
guys
have to
would
make
never
too much of a point.
Yeah, right. Who am I that these guys would want to come through me? So that tendency not to want to believe it. But I've had experiences with 3 mediums independently of one another at different times, in which they picked up on it. I didn't ask them about the book, but they picked up on it. Mm-hmm. And
I think you report one medium said, I see a man dressed in white robes and he's working with you on a book project.
This was, so before I began writing the book, mm-hmm. I wrote a series of short papers, and by short, 20 to 30,000 words. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're between 30 and 50 pages. And I've got about 7 or 8 of them. I think a few are pretty good. But I had a sense when I was doing that this is preliminary to something. I didn't know what, but preliminary to something. And so it's been maybe 20 years that I've been exploring this mm-hmm. This form of writing. First mm-hmm. it was just me and Plato, and then Socrates comes in, and then Spinoza, and then William James. So there was a period of 2 years where I hadn't written anything. And I think it might have been longer. Ken Ring recollects that it was that I told him it was 3 years. Mm-hmm.
Ken Ring, the great researcher of the near-death experience,
that I told him, because he recounts our conversation about that in mm-hmm. one of his writings. And maybe I was just too embarrassed to say for 3 years I did nothing. And then somebody tells me about the Spiritualist Church, which I knew of. It's a part of Americana history, the Spiritualist movement in the late 19th century, and William James was involved somewhat.
Deeply.
Where the pastors were all trained mediums. Uh-huh. But I had thought they went extinct, they died sort of around the time William James died. Yeah. But I realized that they were alive and well, and there was a church in Chicago, and I went there. And everyone gets a short reading at the end of the service. When it came to me, she didn't know me. I just walked in, and she said, there's a gentleman here. Oh, she's also, she's a marvelous human being. Mm-hmm. So she's an African-American woman from the south side of Chicago, and when she gets excited, her accent comes through. Mm-hmm. So she says with some excitement, there's a gentleman here wearing a white robe who's been assisting you with a writing project, and he says to stop dilly-dallying around and get back to it. Now, what do you do when you hear something like that? I had no idea that there was no thought that it was real, that it might be real. Mm-hmm. But here's this woman, she doesn't know me. Yeah. Right. And she says this.
Well, it was the right thing to say, apparently.
Well, apparently, because my left brain went through every possible, you know how it does that. Mm-hmm. How could she possibly have known in an ordinary way? Yeah. And so there's got to be somebody that we both know in common who told her. And there was one person that we both did know in common. Uh-huh. That's how I had heard of the church. Mm-hmm. And I went to ask her, I almost did. Did you tell her? Well, she didn't know. I wasn't going around telling people I was, writing with, talking to Plato or Socrates. Yeah. I didn't want people to think I was nuts. So nobody really knew. Uh-huh. It's the left brain, the logical mind. It goes through every logical possibility of how she could have known this, and then comes to a stop. Mm-hmm. It just stops. Yeah. And in that stopping, something opened up within me. And I said, okay. And I started writing. Mm-hmm. There was one more shorter paper of about 50 pages, and then the book.
An 800-page book, well worth reading. Well, Dr. Neal Grossman, thank you so much for sharing these insights. It's very exciting. I recommend the book highly. I think of it truly as a work of genius.
Thank you. I do not. Mm-hmm.
Well, you're being modest.
No, I am not in a position to evaluate it from an external point of view.
Of course.
I just showed up and wrote the first thing. It's a first draft, the first thing that was come into my mind in the moment.
Well, that's the first thing everybody needs to do, is just show up.
Yeah, I think so.
You know, there's a phrase in the Hebrew scriptures when God calls to people, and when they answer, they say hineni. That's a Hebrew word. It means, here I am.
Yeah. Yeah, that's nice. Also, I don't want to say this. I was retired from the university, except maybe for the first 50 or 80 pages.
Mm-hmm.
So I was free from any kind of external structure. I wasn't writing it for tenure, for salary, for promotion, because that was all gone in the past. Yeah. So I was just writing it as an expression of my own interest and own understanding, and own joy.
You were being true to yourself.
It was a joyous process because I never knew where it was going to take me.
Yeah.
And I was often quite surprised where it was going.
It was being written in the very spirit that you were writing about. I would say, perhaps. And I might just add parenthetically that there's that sense of not being beholden to authority figures is also true of this video channel as well. It gives me the liberty to say, what's deep within my own heart and soul.
Yeah.
And to share that with our viewers. And Dr. Neal Grossman, I'm very happy to be able to share you and your experience.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy.
Viewers. Thank you for being with me, and thank you for being with us.